Hello and welcome. On behalf of the WashU Alumni Association, I'm excited to welcome you to today's presentation, Palace of State, the Eisenhower Executive Office Building with alumnus author Thomas Luebke. My name is Suzanne Wagstaff, and I'm the Senior Director for Alumni Networks at Washington University. Before we begin, I'd like to explain the format for today's session. You will only hear and see me, our moderator, our featured speaker, Thomas, and his presentation. The webinar will last about an hour. Following the conversation, we will have time for a conversation between our moderator and presenter. We encourage you to participate by asking questions at any time by typing in the Q&A box. Thank you to all of you who have already submitted questions via your registration. During the Q&A session, we will get to as many questions as we can. This webinar is being recorded and will be posted on the Alumni Association YouTube channel following the event. It is now my pleasure to introduce today's moderator, Angela Miller. Angela Miller is a professor of art history at Washington University in St. Louis. She is the author of Empire of the Eye, Landscape Representation and American Cultural Politics, 1825 to 1875, and lead author, along with Janet Berlow, Brian Wolfe, and Jennifer Roberts, of American Encounters, Cultural Identity, and the Visual Arts from the Beginning to the Present. She has published widely on 19th and 20th century visual arts and culture. Her current book project, Eros and Dust, explores the queered circle of Lincoln Kirstein in the years around World War II and has received funding from the National Gallery in Washington, D.C., the Metropolitan Museum of Art, and the NEH. Please join me in welcoming Professor Angela Miller.
Thank you, Suzanne. It's wonderful to be here. And I'm really delighted to introduce Thomas Luebke, who has served since 2005 as the secretary of the U.S. Commission of the Fine Arts in Washington, D.C. The U.S. Commission is the federal design agency that oversees all the buildings and public works for the nation's capital. And in that position, Tom reviews up to 800 cases a year, so he's a very busy guy. He also serves as a member of the National Capital Memorials Advisory Commission, as well as the National Council on the Arts and Humanities. Tom is professionally trained as an architect with experience in both planning and in historic preservation in both the public and private sectors. Before coming to Washington, to be on the commission, he served as the city architect for Alexandria, Virginia, where he oversaw design review for both public and large-scale private development. And if you know Alexandria, you may be familiar with the Potomac Yard and Carlisle districts, which Tom oversaw. In addition to the book that we'll be talking about today, Palace of State, the Eisenhower Executive Office Building, about which he's going to be speaking, excuse me, Tom also produced and edited Civic Art, a Centennial History of the U.S. Commission of the Fine Arts. He graduated from Washington University with honors and as a Phi Beta Kappa, and then went on to do a master's in architecture at the Graduate School of Design at Harvard University, where he also served as a teaching fellow in architectural history. He speaks frequently on a range of topics publicly, most of them pertaining to U.S. public architecture. So please visit his bio for more information on his many accomplishments and awards. We're going to drop that link into the chat. So thank you, Tom. It's wonderful to have you here.
Can you hear me? Yeah, good. Well, great. Thank you. It's Suzanne, I think it's great to be here. It's a topic that's of some interest to me. I've spent basically my whole career here in Washington. This is a project that I've been involved with in certain ways for a long time. I'm going to start sharing now and try to bring up that my show, and of course I've gone to the wrong spot, but we're going to start at the beginning. Now, I hope everybody can see that. So the real title of this is actually High Style, Low Morals, the State War and Navy Building and the Second Empire Style. What this is really, I just wanted to talk about this building as an expression of a time and place, America in the post-Civil War Gilded Age, and what this building, how it came to be, and why, what were the forces that brought it brought it about. There it is in its sort of current glory. It's a huge building, and when it was completed, it was actually basically the largest office building in the world, we think. It was 700 and something feet long. It's just immense. It's got quite beautiful architectural detail, iconographic program. You can see these little symbols on the windows represent. It was built for the Departments of State, War, and Navy, and each wing has it had an identity that was then sort of expressed with these little details. Inside, it's also quite magnificent. Tremendous amounts of decorative work, and all of this has been restored recently with these beautiful stenciling. Again, it's very exemplary of late 19th century decorative expression. There's a beautiful restored skylight. These are just some of the images when we'll get into it, but this building has a long story, and of course the Second Empire Style is not everybody's favorite. Most people's not their favorite. So I want to let you guys open your minds, but let's talk about it for a sec. It has a long arc that starts strong and has some troubles in between and is now back up on the upswing. I'm just going to quickly read some quotes from the building was completed in 1888, started in 1871, completed in 1888. At the time, a historian said, well, it's altogether one of the finest buildings, if not the finest building in the world. Some years later, in the middle of the 30s, when this style was at its absolute, considered the worst possible, the chairman of the commission that I run said the State, War, and Navy building pseudo-classicism employed hundreds of stunted columns, a multitude of feeble pediments, projections everywhere, and a roof that the camel's hump would put to shame, all done in the name of classic art. Simplicity, proportion, dignity, and beauty, those fundamental principles of classical architecture, all went by the board. So it was, and at this time, this was a time when all these buildings were being demolished. Then, just 20 years later, when this building was actually being considered very seriously for demolition, Eisenhower, who was president at the time, said, well, put it this way, I worked 9 years in the building, and so from sentiment's sake, I would probably wouldn't want it to see it torn down. Now, that's not exactly a ringing endorsement, especially for the guy whose name ended up on the building. But only 20 years later, the preservation movement had sort of taken off, and a sort of a reassessment had occurred. And the very prominent architectural historian Henry Russell Hitchcock said it is perhaps the best extant example in America of the Second Empire. The complex massing of the mansards, especially over the center, and the dignified restraint of the building are unequaled. And I'm done reading these quotes. I just wanted to sort of give you that idea of how this building has its perception and its how it's held has changed over time. It's a story that's inseparable from the story of Washington as the capital. And Washington has always been this expression of a sort of rhetorical realization in stone and brick of what we aspire to as a nation in the government. And it starts with the L'Enfant Plan. Everybody's familiar with this, I hope. Drawn in the 1790s after the state was the capital was established here. It's a very interesting combination of working with topography, a grid which is sort of the fabric of the city, and then cutting through it with all these diagonals which commemorate the states, the colonies, the states that became the foundation of the country, and where these intersect, the very principal buildings were set up. Principally the Capitol here on a hill, the White House at the other end, and the whole thing sort of surrounded by a beautiful ring of, we call it the topographic bowl, in the planning work that we do, but that's sort of gets the setting. And of course, in the middle ground is this sort of mall area that we know today. I'm just going to clear that. Just wanted to share that with you since we had it. It's not going down. Sorry. There we go. But the initial architecture that was inserted there was actually fairly modest. Remember, this is a very provincial, not a rich country, big, but very, very much in its early years. This was the original Capitol building. This is an engraving from the early 19th century. Very simple, restrained classicism. The White House, actually drawing on Georgian roots, a little bit more even from the 18th century, simple kind of stuff. People make a lot about the idea of the aspirations of the country's governance coming out of classical philosophy and culture. There's, of course, that's true, and that the architecture reflects that. That's also true, but the other thing to remember is that this was the style. Classicism, starting in the 1790s, was actually the international kind of accepted standard in most of these European countries. So it's partial. There's a lot of, this is a provincial place, and they're always copying what's happening in the big towns. This is the city hall, designed by an English architect, George Hadfield, who then comes back. This is a view of the city from the Anacostia side in about 1830. And okay, so this is 40 years later. Look at how the city, it's a brick town, but there's not that much that you can see. There's two major public buildings, the Capitol on the ridge on the right, the White House a little bit in the distance on the left, and then there's the Navy Yard, a munitions factory in the foreground. There's just not that much here. Washington it's about to take a bigger leap in the 1830s, where we start to see more development. But in the meantime, around the White House was emerging the places where the U.S. government had to be accommodated. Now, we're not talking about thousands of people. We're talking about hundreds. There were 4 buildings for the only 4 departments of the entire government: State, War, Navy, Treasury. That was it. There were these 4 buildings done by that same architect Hadfield, adjacent to the White House. By the 1840s, there's a kind of a leap in scale, and of course, who gets the first big building? It's the Treasury Department, because they're raking it in with tariffs and trade. You can see this new big building, the Treasury Department, coming up. It used to be in a little building on the left. It's about to eat the State Department up there in the foreground. It's designed by the very prominent mid-19th century architect Robert Mills. You can see Mills' most famous probably design is in the background on the left is the Washington Monument, just under construction in the 1840s, where it sort of stays like a stump until the 1880s. It just as the Treasury then completed right after the Civil War. And the reason why the Treasury is so important is because it informs our building completely. And in fact, this building was completed by the same architect who did the State, War, and Navy, or Eisenhower building. I just want to talk a little bit about mid-19th century styles. It wasn't all Italianate or even federal. I mean, it starts federal, it goes into Italian, but there's other modes. I just want to mention in passing the revival modes of Gothic and the medievalizing style, which is popular, but it tends to go with institutions with moral, some sort of moral message or content. We have the Smithsonian Castle you see on the left. That's from 1849, James Renwick. So that's an institution for the dissemination of and research, dissemination of knowledge. On the right is the city jail, done in a very sort of tough medieval kind of way. And then on the bottom is this immense National Hospital for the Insane, the Army and Navy in DC. It's called St. Elizabeth's, also from the 1850s. It served in that capacity, and the campus is big, and it served in that capacity for almost a century, and then recently has been turned into the headquarters of the Department of Homeland Security. The other big trend, and this is going to take us right into our story, is the idea of the Baroque revival. This is a term we don't talk about a lot. but it is a sort of the central mid-Victorian mode. The best example in Washington is the Capitol Dome. This is clearly not your restrained neoclassical stuff. This is a big dome, much bigger. It sort of dwarfs the idea of the building it's on top of, and its sort of design lineage comes right out of Europe, the St. Peter's in Rome, then via St. Paul's in London. It's sort of this reiteration of this is the seat of where it's all happening. Boom. Interestingly, the Baroque revival is associated, really it's a 17th century phenomenon drawing on, Renaissance and other models, but it's associated with absolute power, the power of these emergent monarchs in particularly France, Louis the 13th and 14th. And to some extent also the Catholic Church and the rise of the Counter-Reformation and Rome. So it's an interesting thing. The idea of power is always kind of an interesting subtext in these Baroque examples. The Gardens of Versailles is sort of the quintessential landscape idea where you have a very privileged view that is very constructed, and there's a spot where the king's bed is that takes it all in, and all lines lead to the single point. So that's just an interesting kind of part of the lineage here. Back to our story in DC, this is a picture from about 1870, and after the Civil War, you can see the Capitol with its dome completed on the right, the White House complex in that sort of curvy, grassy area on the left. There's a lot of commercial development happening in between on Pennsylvania Avenue. It's flanked on the right by the Treasury Department, and then this big new building, the Departments of State, War, and Navy, in this new building, which hasn't even been built at the time of this engraving, on the left. It is, again, but this time you now have the Department of Agriculture and Interior, but there's still just 6, right? As opposed to whatever we are today, 19 or something. But the story about these two buildings flanking the White House becomes very important. Here we are, north is actually down. So the Treasury Department is on the left, which was actually built like this, and they were trying to come up with a twin. And so the Department of State, War, and Navy were going to go into this twin building on the west side of the White House. And you can see it's basically looks almost exactly the same without the center wing. Well, nothing really changed. This drawing was done in 1852. And nothing really ever changes here. They end up, coming up with, you'll see it all comes up pretty quickly. So to get to our building, I just want to talk a little bit about the genealogy of this style. The style per se is really French, but to some extent, the way it gets expressed in this official, bureaucratic architecture really comes through the British. So I'm going to go back again to the 17th century. Here's the old Louvre, and the Louvre is sort of cobbled together over centuries. And here's the famous, this is the old palace. This is the pavilion, what becomes known as the pavilion of the clock or the l'horloge. You can see all this kind of crazy stuff around it, but this gets renovated by the 19th century into something quite dramatic and different. In the background is that same pavilion. It's just been encrusted with a lot of other stuff. Sculptures. So this is this kind of amazing start 1830s. So this is now the Bourbon Restoration, and then eventually it becomes associated with this mid 19th century French government, and urbanism. So it's very appealing. To contrast the British and the French, the French are the premier military power in the 17th century, and they lose it eventually with the Napoleonic era. And Britain takes over as the most powerful international state. So they've got all the hard power. But the French sort of hold on to the soft power. They're the art, the opera, the clothes, the food, everything is French. So there's this kind of interesting thing where there's this I think there's a vibe of sensuality and luxury and consumption that is sort of burbling up out of France, and there's an emergent middle class, merchant class. It's really interested in consumption that starts, and this becomes associated with that era. There's also Napoleon in the middle of the century. Napoleon III is brought in 1851, I think. This shows him and his queen in front of the Tuileries Palace, which is actually still at the end of this whole Louvre complex. It's no longer there. But you can see, again, it's that very, very, appealing, seductive kind of glamorous architecture at the time, very much associated with this cultural phenomenon. Whereas, well, let me go. This sort of iconic view of these buildings sort of gets turned into an architectural motif that gets propagated everywhere. That's the horloge, the pavilion of the clock, and here is the Boston City Hall from 1865. This is just a little bit before our building, but you can see this is a smaller building, but you can see this sort of attempt to bring that sumptuousness into Boston, which is kind of amazing for this time. This is the height of the abolition movement, et cetera. But you can see that this is what people think is the right thing to do. There's also an association from the French side, I think, with palace, urban palaces or villas and museums, institutions, the arts. This is actually designed in the 50s in Washington. This is the first dedicated art museum in the United States for the Corcoran, the war financier, William Corcoran builds it. It's dedicated to art. And in fact, the building is very much a sort of sequence of rooms like an urban palace. Where we're going to go, though, is back to Britain. They have a huge administrative apparatus to control all of this immense overseas empire. The sun never sets on the British Empire. It's everywhere. They have a huge bureaucracy. And what they do is, this is partially about the emergence of the bureaucracy and the offices that it takes to everyone has scribes and people writing and rooms and rooms and rooms, all this stuff happening. You got to house them in something, but in a way that reflects the importance of and significance of this empire. And so this was the winning competition for the new Whitehall District Foreign Office, basically the State Department for the British Empire. It doesn't ever get built, but this is the two top winners were in this style in 1857. So what you have is a fairly austere idea about a building. It's kind of functional, right? It's almost modern. It's like a factory of getting work done, and it's got all this stuff appended to it to make it look incredibly important and fancy. This idea, of course, the British are everywhere, and these ideas about this style go everywhere with it. We have Canada, Australia, Kolkata, Vienna. I mean, it's all over the place. It's in South America. And it's fascinating kind of ways this stuff looks all over. I mean, this is all done from the 1870s, at that era. It also comes to the United States, which is really our story. Quickly, Alfred B. Mullet is, in some ways, the protagonist of this whole style in America for these government buildings. He is an English-born but raised in Ohio. He's an architect. He ends up he follows his mentor, Isaiah Rogers from Cincinnati to Washington, and then eventually gets him removed from his job and takes over as the head architect for the Treasury Department, which is kind of a good move. This is all basically happens. The real highlight of this is with President U.S. Grant who was elected in 1868, serves 1869 to 76. This is the time for this style. And the Grant administration, as you probably know, has kind of long been associated with a lot of problems. He himself, not so much personally, but surrounded by a lot of people who were involved in graft, corruption, various, bid rigging, all sorts of difficult stuff. People going on trial, going to jail, et cetera. It's known for its association with this. So that was once the title, high style and low morals. The Grant administration was pretty much that. And of course, it's also happening at the same time when in the United States, we're moving past the kind of the horror chapter of the Civil War and moving into a time of this is now the burgeoning of the second industrial revolution, the creation of tremendous wealth that has never existed in this country before. The White House was the biggest house in the United States until the late 1860s. So, and now it's like, well, guys, but this is a time of tremendous change. This Mullet builds designs for the Treasury Department because they have these. There's only a few kinds of buildings they build: post offices, custom houses, and courthouses. These are these federal buildings, and what they're custom houses all over the country. But Mullet gets in charge of this stuff, and he's doing these big buildings in all the major U.S. cities: Boston, New York, Philadelphia, Baltimore, Cincinnati, St. Louis, Washington, New Orleans, and San Francisco. These are in Chicago, if I missed that. Those are the biggest cities in the country, and that's where every one of them gets one of these big buildings. The biggest and best is probably, arguably, New York. This is the post office and custom house there. Just unbelievable. And this is very characteristic. You can see that idea from the pavilion at the Louvre, kind of getting bigger and bigger. They're always really horizontal. You get these kind of stacked layers like a cake, boom, 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 and then encrusted with these sort of smaller gestures of doubled columns and statues and pediments and these big ballooning roofs and stuff. So this is kind of the vocabulary. But what you're doing, again, he's applying this very sort of sensuous filigree to what is essentially a big box. Here are these buildings all over the country. Lower left, that's the one we just saw in New York as built. Boston, Philadelphia, but of course St. Louis had its own. And that still stands today and was never demolished. A lot of these were. New York, for Boston, and I think Philadelphia was demolished as well. The anti-hero of the piece is Orville Babcock, who was General Grant's aide-de-camp during the war, and then became his secretary at the White House, and was involved in a number of scandals in his own right. Exonerated in a national trial in St. Louis, having to do with the whiskey ring, but eventually, I think he was disgraced and eventually died young. This is just a funny editorial cartoon, which is about all the scandals in the government. Grant is there holding all these people up. There are 6 of them. 4 of them are somehow closely associated with the construction of this building. The guy in the lower left with the red headband, that's Boss Shepard, who was a plumbing contractor who became the city's second governor in the early 1870s. So let's go to the building itself, just quickly to talk about it. Again, you can see like this sort of sumptuous design with the big central pavilion and stuff, but if you kind of step back and go, oh, it's actually rather repetitive, right? It's actually this kind of grid of, an array of rat-a-tat-a-tat-a-tat-a-tat-a-tat-a windows, and then carefully Mullet has sort of decorated the center and the corners so that it sort of feels like a bigger composition. But these things are, 800 feet long. You have to do something. There it is. And because of this pushing and pulling of the planes and these porches and roof things, it starts to get this real sort of sculptural effect, which has a big impact. Again, we're talking about something that's pretty boxy underneath, but you can see the sort of the trick of it. There's the plan. I don't know if you're familiar with reading plans, but if you really look at it, it is a figure 8, a square figure 8 of just double-loaded corridors with some fancy stuff at the outside, at the corners. It's just the most simple thing. There it is. This is cutting through the courtyard. The courtyard is so austere, it looks like a prison yard. Just look at that array. It's just like, we're not doing the decor in the middle. But actually, they did actually push it up in certain areas, particularly circulation spaces and some libraries and reception rooms. These are these beautiful details of the stairways, which are just lovely, delicate. These are all granite, solid granite stairs, which are cantilevered into the wall, and then they just kind of arc super gracefully from story to story. Check that out. That's a picture of after some restoration, but this goes up for like 6 stories, so it's quite impressive. Again, translating all these material, very modern materials, actually cast iron, moving that into and machine cut stone was another innovation of the time. I just want to talk quickly about building typologies because, I talked about the emergence of the office building in the 19th century. The other kind of building that it's related to are hotels, because hotels are like room. It's a very kind of regimented idea, and I think Mullet actually worked for Rogers in Cincinnati, who was the designer of his claim to fame was actually hotels. He did the Maxwell House in Nashville. He did the Tremont House in Boston. That was his thing, and it was basically taking a very repetitive, boxy thing and turning it into something a little bit more expressive. The other similar ideas, in New York at the same time, you have cast iron technology turning warehouses, trying to maximize the light, very repetitive, very rational in its way, which is something that it's similar to what happens in these office buildings. So there's our office building. Look, if you can drop the idea of all this layering, all of a sudden you see how very simple it is. There it is, all 800 feet of it. So again, it started in 1871, completed 1888. It's already a little out of style, but by 20 years later, it's really out of style. And well, I'm skipping ahead. I was going to say that in the meantime, still in the 1870s, that Second Empire style becomes the expression of urbanism, at least in a lot of cities in America. This is Washington's Market Square. This is Pennsylvania Avenue. Sorry for the terrible picture, but you can sort of get that character. You have hotels. You can see both of these hotels are older buildings in a kind of a simpler style. Then they put the Empire mansard hats on it to make it fancier for the current tastes. These are institutions, different. So it's all of these are residential, row house developments in the middle of the central city. These are senators' homes or the British Embassy on the left. So it was very much what people did in those areas. Now it wasn't just WashU, everywhere. And the other thing about that sort of the French mode and the idea of consumption and luxury and delectation, hotels, theaters. These are examples from New York and San Francisco. This was the style. San Francisco is probably notorious. It also gets associated in a way with the emergent, so small town America in the middle western states, pretty much, as well as you think about cowboy country when old western towns, of that post-Civil War, they kind of have that same vibe. You sort of think about opera houses and brothels as sort of part of the progeny of this style. Now, back to where I was saying, it goes completely out of style. And by the 20s, and modernism starts moving, and this is a picture from the early 30s. This is that New York Post Office and Custom House being torn down. And the statue in the front is a statue of a male virtue trotting on a female vice. And I'm sure that those who were happy to see that very ebullient building go away. But it lives on in popular culture in strange ways. The Second Empire style lives on as this kind of half-forgotten, slightly creepy, older, dissociated style. Another era that is no longer, this is an interesting movie if you've ever seen it, but it keeps coming back, especially in the mid-20th century. There it is in Giant, this kind of fallen family of, sort of origins. Psycho, there it is. And finally, it becomes, ridiculous, the Addams Family. But there it is. It's the same style coming back, and it comes back to that strange period of this post-Civil War era where it was suddenly incredibly fashionable and incredibly appealing, and then it sort of wasn't. The other place where it really shows up is Disneyland, of all places. But he grew up in a small town in Missouri. And I forget the name of it off the top of my head, but a small town that was sort of built up in the 1870s, 80s would have been completely done in that style. And that, of course, is in Disney's head, that is the architecture of his childhood context. So what killed it? Again, it was sort of the reemergence of an Anglo-American sensibility, which starts in the 1890s really, and just kind of takes over. We call it the colonial revival in some places, and this is just sort of your typical version of that. The real, on the official side, it was the Chicago exhibition, the Chicago Fair, 1892 to 4. Huge. You can't. It's hard to underestimate the impact of this exhibition. Literally a third of the population of the United States came to Chicago to see this thing, all built out of plaster. First, completely lit with electric light. For a lot of people, it was the first time they'd ever seen electric lights, and you can imagine how intense that was for people. And it comes to Washington as well. This is the Macmillan Plan from 1901. Daniel Burnham, the planner from Chicago, was the planner for this. And this was like an idea, like how we could turn Washington into a capital that reflects these principles. And the amazing thing is that when you fly into Washington, it sort of looks like this, which was an amazing thing because it didn't in 1900. This is our building again, proposed to be reclad. You can see the tops being erased out, and they're going to make it look like the Treasury Department. There's another drawing. I'm worried about running out of time, so I'm going to kind of move ahead. But the building stays on. This is from about 1920. You can sort of the teens. You can see how crammed it is. All these clerks and everybody, file cabinets in the hallways. The government just keeps getting bigger. It's especially in this time. This is sort of like coming out of the war, World War I. During World War II, all sorts of stuff happens to the building. These are just interesting photographs that show them dismantling decorative cannon from probably the Spanish War being melted into munitions for the World War II. They cover up and paint over all the skylights because of the air raid risk. And so by the 1980s, this is the building. What's happening on the interiors. Basically everything has been painted beige. They've got cabling running through like nobody's business, and drapes, flat ceilings because nobody likes what's underneath. You can see in that lower left corner the cast iron columns of what is on the right, which is actually the War Department library, which is one of the most spectacular spaces in Washington. It's a very intimate but beautiful cast iron space with all this detail that's done in electroplating in 3 different tones. It's just a gem. And sort of this is the latest of the spaces from the 1880s. It's very much in this kind of interesting, it has a lot of like Islamic influence on it. It's a really interesting space. I'm just going to move up into the 21st century. This is really because of 9/11 and they decided for the first time in history, they're going to actually comprehensively renovate the building. And here it is under construction. This is the first time systems, structure, cabling, air handling, everything gets redone in a comprehensive way. So this is tremendous. And this effort is what culminated in my book project, because they had they wanted to publicize and record what happened. So just some eye candy at the end. There's some of the beautiful spaces that came out that were restored. These stairways. This is the old Secretary of Navy's suite, which is now the Vice President's ceremonial office. This is what was the Navy reception room, showing some of the sequence of how it was restored. This is the East Dome. Again, sort of this big restoration effort of all this glass was painted over but not removed, which is the other one that you saw was actually replaced. This is again taking, upper left is what it looked like in the turn of 1900. By 2000 it was just stripped to vanilla, nothing, and then has been restored again. There's that skylight that was reconstructed. The framework was there, but the glass was all gone. So it lives on. It's a sort of a witness of an era. It doesn't have a lot of. It's a kind of an outlier in official Washington because of its character, but it's a really important witness to a particular time in our history. And I've just been privileged to have a chance to work on its restoration in a couple of capacities. So I'm glad to share that with you. This book is we got so many images from the GSA, and so there's about 500 here, and then I encourage you to, if you ever have a chance, it's quite an amazing thing. It's hard to get into the building because it is a very secure building, and it's hard to get in, but the book tries to explain what it's like inside. So I'm going to stop my share, I think, and come back to the panel. Is that what I'm supposed to do?
Yeah, that's right.
Okay.
Hi, thank you. That was great, Tom. Really fascinating. And as I told you, I rode my bicycle many times past that building and never really noticed it. It's enormous.
It is enormous.
I mean,
Yeah.
it's 800 square feet. It takes up a full city block. I have a bunch of questions, but I also want to make sure that the audience has a chance to send us questions. So I'll start with a few, and then we'll see what kinds of questions come forth from the audience.
Sure.
I'm curious about, the sheer scale. That's the first thing. You said the biggest office building in the world at that time. And there really wasn't any
Probably in the US. I should be careful about that. But
in the US.
nonetheless,
Yeah. But there was no precedent up to that point for the scale of that building. So
well, there were these bigger government buildings, like the Mint in San
the Mint was
Francisco
pretty big, yeah.
is also on that same level. But this one was, this is the State Department, and it's the Departments of War and Navy, which eventually becomes the Pentagon, right? So this is the core of the whole executive branch of the federal government, and it's all in one building. So that's why it was so huge.
Yeah, but it also strikes me as a sort of cultural historian, as an index or a symptom of this kind of ballooning of the federal government after the Civil War, that the federal government is just getting a lot bigger. Isn't that part of what's going on?
It does grow. I mean, it tends to grow with every war, but we're also seeing a time of tremendous increases in complexity. In other words, in the early 19th century, you're living on tariffs. And there's just not that much government services, and so you can imagine suddenly. First of all, the war effort, they actually introduced the income tax just to keep the government solvent, and that's in 1863. You have to. It all goes hand in hand. You have the introduction of telegraphs, telephones, all this burgeoning technology of communication, everything else, and with it brings the need for regulation, tremendous changes. So it's kind of in stride. In fact, I think it's a little late compared to other countries.
Yeah, well, it's 1888, and it's interesting that by the time it's finished, it's almost already out of style.
For sure. By the 1880s, you've been through other flirtations with other styles, sort of, you think about the whole Richardsonian Romanesque movement is sort of an 1880s thing. That's over. I mean, this is sort of, by that time, it's a couple of generations of style gone by.
Yeah. I'm curious, I was thinking as you were talking about the scale of private architecture, which is also becoming very, very large. I mean, you think of Biltmore, the Vanderbilt mansion in the Carolinas. You think of
that's actually, I think, in the 20th. You get this huge, and if anybody's watched that Gilded Age show, you sort of see that leap from that mid-century sort of smaller scale to suddenly there is tremendous wealth being generated. It's industrial. You have railroads, steel production in this country goes up between 1870 and 1900 it goes up about 10 times. And it takes the United States from a regional power to one of the very largest economies in the world in just 30 years. So it's this kind of hard to imagine the rate of just tremendous growth, and the buildings come with it. There's so much more money. They're like, oh, we got to spend it on stuff. We got this kind of new ethos of consumption and display, and that's what's so interesting about that Second Empire style, because it's all about it's lush. And it's very attention grabbing.
Yeah, it is. But that's, I mean, again, as a historian of, the sort of contradictions within the identity of the nation, it's really problematic, as you know, it by the 1930s, which is a period of austerity, there's this total renunciation of this style and what it stands for. And so I've always been interested in what I think of as the sort of the signifying functions of style. And if you think about what preceded it, you know, the Greek Revival, Thomas Jefferson is using the Greek Revival, which is a style associated with austerity of ancient Greece as one of the first republics in the ancient world, and America modeling itself on that, you know, on very much on that precedent in the period before the Civil War, to have this unabashedly imperial image of a nation that has now, you know, kind of embracing all of the things that republics were supposed to renounce, like luxury and wealth and power. You know,
I'm not
there's
sure they ever did, but now they've got more of it.
right. But I mean, I think, you know, you have the colonial revival, I think comes in a little, I think it starts with 1876 with the centennial, which is commemorating the anniversary of George Washington's inauguration. So you have this tension right at the heart of the Gilded Age, looking back to an older republic, a more chaste republic.
Well,
and so there's
also
yes.
there's also a kind of an idea of frankly of ethnographic purity or with the colonial revival and going back to the British roots, and that we're essentially an Anglo-European culture and we need to go back to that. And so there is a repudiation of this, you know, there's something vaguely foreign perhaps to the American eye about this French sort of fancy style. You know, it's and I think that there is a kind of an underlying resonance where we're used to not seeing stuff that's quite so florid. It sort of lives on in a lot of other countries, like in South America and the Balkans and other places. It kind of lives this uninterrupted life all the way up until modernism.
Right.
Sort of the vocabulary, what we call the Belle Epoque.
Belle Epoque.
So it sort of has much more of a continuity there, whereas at least in the United States, it kind of gets blown away by this. As you said, there's a kind of a repudiation of that and trying to focus the country's public culture into something more, a little bit more austere, and it's actually Roman originally. Jefferson's era is Roman classicism. The Greek comes a little later, but
absolutely,
the Roman, clearly the Chicago Fair and that whole style that informs all civic architecture for 40 years is Roman imperial architecture.
Right.
Which isn't, it's big and it's bold, but it's not that fancy.
Yeah, that's the difference from, I was going to ask you about the sort of neo-Baroque versus the Beaux-Arts, where you have American architects routinely going to Paris to the École des Beaux-Arts to be trained. But it's a more, you're right, it's a more restrained style.
It's more restrained, And you get it's monumental. You get huge 3-story columns, and you know, you do that kind of composition as opposed to our guys who are doing this sort of stacky wedding cake thing, which is all kind of, you know, so that's the funny kind of, it's almost like it's like a factory in drag. You know, it's got this table after table after table, you know, on and on and on. And then you've got on the outside, you've got a few like really fancy reception rooms, but that, you know, then it's sort of this fuss at the portals, you know, where you walk in. So it's this kind of funny double-sided thing. Whereas those smaller buildings, like the kind of what I would say if you know the term hotel particulier, the French kind of urban palaces, they have that whole idea. The outside comes all the way in. You have these sequences, like the opera would be in Paris is another example. But you have rooms and salons and stairs and corridors, and it's a much more integrated experience. Where this is clearly show. Something that's incredibly utilitarian at its heart.
But that style lends itself to expansiveness, right? I mean, if you've got a lot of, it can be it can be expanded for full city.
I've talked about this. The problem with their strict kind of classical the temple form is that it's not that
Right,
elastic. You can't do that much with it. When you start to play with all these layers and
right.
pavilions and pushing and pulling, you can do hotels, you can do opera houses, you can do auditorium. It's very, you can do all
Yeah,
sorts of stuff, and it's very um, adaptable. So
absolutely. I'll take any questions from the audience, but while those are coming, to switch tracks a little bit and ask you about your current work on the U.S. Commission of Fine Arts.
uh, go ahead.
Well, I mean, yeah, we can continue. We can keep talking about the building as you
Well,
like.
no, it's fine. I'll answer that. The Commission of Fine Arts actually grows out of that monumental planning for DC of the turn of the century and gets established by Daniel Burnham, the Chicago Fair guy, the
Right,
Macmillan
right.
Plan designer, ends up being the first chair of the Commission of Fine Arts. And what we are is essentially, it's essentially established as it's kind of to carry out, make sure that that Macmillan Plan actually happens is where it's
Huh, okay.
starts. And it's design review. We don't actually manage the building. We don't acquire them. We don't commission them. We don't do
Huh,
anything. We actually work on that front end, the design, as the buildings are sort of, but this is now 112 years of history
yeah.
in a couple weeks. That whole Beaux-Arts era that it came out of is long gone. That changed in the 40s. And then it was all about modernism. And that changed in the
uh,
70s and 80s. And then it was all about postmodernism. And now we're in a completely different sort of focus again, having to do more with sustainability, and God knows what we're going to see with the impact of digitization, virtual issues, and what it means for the workplace. So one major thing that we spend a lot of time focusing on are memorials, the National Mall, museums of the Smithsonian, and so all of these sort of questions of national representation. That's sort of the common thread. And this building, the old State Department and War Department, was part of that. It's a sort of assertion of we're all grown up and we're a big country with a big fancy building. That's a question of projecting identity. And
yeah,
it's
yeah.
a game that happens at every generation all the time in different ways. It
Mhm.
was much more architectural those days. We're probably into something else now, and that's going to affect, for example, what happens at museums too. So it's an interesting.
Yeah, that was my question, was really about, whether the commission is really there to uphold you're arbitrating the look of public spaces in the nation's capital. How susceptible are you to sort of shifts in taste, in architectural
You
taste?
know, there's no way to separate them.
Mhm.
People have their, people's tastes change, and I have a sort of rule like whatever was built 35 years ago was probably awful to, in some ways to people. Like there's always this kind of evolution, and what was cool to your parents was probably not to you, but your grandparents you might like. I mean, there's a certain evolution there. One of the questions in the Q&A was about this.
Uh,
Reminds this person about brutalism, which is a particular kind of expression that starts in the 50s, but really is big in the United States in public architecture starting in the late 60s into the 70s. It's really about the frank expression of structure, uh,
mhm.
undecorated concrete, etc. Um, it has a whole moral program that's kind of interesting. Um, that's one of these things that has been quite out of style, and is now with younger people are saying, no, we really, and a lot of people love to trash brutalism, but it's actually got a lot more popular support now because people starting to understand why it's interesting or why it's important. So these things change. I mean, in
I know,
19,
but then how do you arbitrate that? That was my question,
well,
exactly.
you do the best you
All
can. I mean, you have. I mean, we have preservation standards, and what you try to do is you try to define these properties by what they contribute in terms of your cultural or whatever history, or artistic quality, and sometimes they don't measure up, and you gotta say, you know what, this one isn't such a great example. So
Mhm.
you try, but the lens of that is actually trying to be a little bit, like a historian about it, and saying, let's try not to get too attached to a single style because we all have our own taste. We all have our own maybe moral universe that says, Gothic revival is the best thing ever, or I just love, you know, super modern minimalism. But in the end, they all have their certain validity because they sort of emerge as from their own. It's informed by technology and all these other cultural influences, but they all have their own kind of integrity over time. So I'm not saying that we're a preservation board. What we're trying to do is actually just apply good design guidance to make what comes through as good as it could be.
Yeah, just quality, issues of
It's
quality.
really about quality. It's trying
Yeah.
not to get too. There's a couple
Yeah.
of
Question.
questions that.
I would like to know your take on what the building currently represents given current events and who works there now. So in other words, does it carry the same, I think what this person is asking is whether it carries the same associations with imperial might.
Well, I don't think so because it's such an odd style now that I don't think people think about it that way. It has it's got a presence. It's such a big pile, it's just,
Right.
it's overwhelming, but it doesn't, because it's sort of like a little bit like a lost language. Like you don't quite know what it's saying because we don't speak that sort of stylistic language, or we don't recognize it as well. It started out as these three of the four state, federal agency department, and then it ended up being all state, which is why it's called Palace of State, because it was the State Department forever. And then since the late 40s, it has been the Executive Office of the President. So it's basically got taken over the Truman administration to house. You want to talk about growth of the American government? 30s, 40s, 50s, just mushrooms. So they build that, and they take over that building. They build another building, another executive building next across the street that's as big, not nearly as memorable. So to answer the question that the person asked, I don't know whether you can how people perceive this building. I tend to look at it from an architect or an architectural historical lens. Others may look at it as still feeling like it's a kind of a bombastic imposition of somebody's particular power. I don't know. Somebody else might think of it as actually picturesque and evocative of an era of, parasols and Parisian flaneurs. So it's a really hard question to ask. It's hard to get into, so it has a little bit of a fortress vibe. As the French Empire style goes, this is one of the most austere and forbidding compared to the more sumptuous, the kind of what we talked about, the hotels, the opera houses, the galleries. It's much more like, it's a harder, kind of tougher building.
Yeah. There was a question earlier about why the Navy is not part of the War Department, why it's a separate department. Well, it was back then.
It's an interesting question of like our history. When the Constitution and government was established in the 1789 and into the 1790s, 4 departments were established: the State, Treasury, War, and Navy. War and Navy stayed separate, and they were not combined until the late 40s when it became the Department of Defense after World War II. So that's eventually where they end up in. That's where you end up in the Pentagon. They were in different places in the meantime, but that's an interesting, just administrative story. There was one other question that was kind of interesting. Chicago World's Fair. It's 1890s, looks similar to the St. Louis Fair. That's correct. St. Louis. So what you have is the beginning of these huge international expositions. They start in France, of course, where these trends often begin. Well, actually, 1851 is the Prince Albert and the Glass Palace, Crystal Palace. The kind of the character of it starts in France, but then in the United States, Chicago really sets that tone in the 1890s, and the St. Louis Fair is basically a kind of I don't want to say it's a knockoff, but it's in the same vein. It's not
Yeah.
it's derivative of the Chicago styles, and yes, they're very closely connected.
Mhm.
It's that same era of monumental classicism.
And it's the same group of Beaux-Arts architects, Richard Morris Hunt and his crowd, Burnham,
Very much so.
working
Yeah.
together. Burnham, what was it? Make no little plans, Burnham. So someone is knocking the brutalism. Brutalism is the favorite style to knock. I personally like it, but that building was torn down, and you know, we have now a kind of form of collegiate Gothic that is a second or third generation.
You
We
mean at
also have
WashU?
yeah, WashU.
Yeah,
We
yeah,
also have a new campus that is very modern, very
Yeah.
very much part of a contemporary language. So, I mean, I think personally that there's room for all of those. I think that if you look at our cohort, our associated institutions in the East, like Harvard and Princeton, they are hiring architects who are designing in a contemporary
general,
mode.
yeah, yeah. I mean, the historicist work that you see, a lot of it was really from the 80s, 90s, especially 90s, and I'd say is the Princeton also did a lot of that kind of stuff. It comes and
Yeah,
goes.
yeah,
They were
yeah.
doing very historicist work at a lot of these schools all the way through the 30s into the 40s, and it stops. If you take a step back and go, oh gosh, this is actually a trend over
Yeah,
many decades or generations,
absolutely.
centuries, you can see